guys, it's Shara from Woodshop Diaries, and in the spirit of the upcoming holidays, in this video, I'm gonna be sharing 5 handmade gift ideas that you can make and give this season. And because I know that nobody has any spare time at this time of the year, I made these as quick and easy to build as possible. Speaking of quick, I've got to shove 5 projects into this one video, so if you're ready to just dive in and get building, let's go. The first project I'm sharing is my favorite of the 5. All you need is a piece of scrap 3/4 inch plywood and some 1x material. First, I ripped 2-inch wide strips from my walnut board. You need at least enough of this to be able to wrap around the plywood piece that you're using. Then I adjusted the table saw to cut a 3/8 inch by 3/4 inch rabbet into one corner of the strips. Basically, I just wanted to notch out a section that the plywood panel could fit into. You could make this tray with square corners, but I marked and cut the corners off at 45 degrees for some added detail. Then I cut to fit the 2-inch notch strips around the plywood panel. Since the corners were cut at 45 degrees, I needed to bevel the edges of the sides here 22.5 degrees. I cut to fit a long side, a corner, and a short side around this piece, and once I had one of each, I could just use them as templates to cut the rest of the pieces. The long sides, the short sides, and the corners should all be the same lengths around the tray. After dry fitting everything together, I sanded each piece well, then set the plywood panel aside for now. I glued the outside pieces together, trying not to overdo the glue as the inside corners are going to be hard to clean if there's a bunch of squeeze out. I used a small ratchet clamp to clamp these pieces until they were dry. Then I cleaned up the corners and removed all the glue that I could and test fit the plywood panel into the bottom. After I made sure it would fit, I removed it, added some wood glue, then placed it back inside and clamped it until it was dry. At this point, the tray is ready for finish, but I wanted to add a couple of handles. The screws wouldn't fit all the way through the 2-inch thick sides, so first I pre-drilled the holes all the way through with a smaller bit. Then I used a larger bit to drill about halfway through from the bottom side. This allowed me to install the screws from the bottom so that they barely stuck out the top to attach the handles. To finish up, I applied walrus oil furniture butter. This would make the perfect Christmas, wedding, or housewarming gift and can be customized to just about any size that you'd like. You can make this simple book stand from about 4 foot of 1x6 board, and in this case, I use mahogany wood. First, I trimmed 2 pieces about 14 inches long to make the back panel of the bookstand. I ran these pieces through the table saw to square up the edges before gluing them together. Once the glue dried, I trimmed one end of the panel square, which will be the bottom, and then I traced a handle design on the top. By the way, I've linked printable plans for this bookstand in the video description. And speaking of plans, I've got more easy gift idea plans available in my shop, powered by Shopify. If you haven't heard of Shopify, first of all, how have you not heard of it? Shopify is a leading global all-in-one commerce platform that powers millions of businesses, including my own, in over 175 countries. When I decided to open a shop back in 2020, I had no idea what I was doing. And to be honest, who really does when they're first starting out? But Shopify made it so easy to get started, from setting up my shop's website to creating product pages to fulfilling my digital orders. For someone like me who is a creator first, business owner second, Shopify has been incredibly helpful with tools and resources that allow me to learn and grow along with my business. If you've been considering starting or growing your own business, or you know someone who is, start your free trial with Shopify today at shopify.com/woodshopdiaries or scan the QR code. At this point, the cookbook stand handle has been cut, drilled, and sanded, and next I needed to add the book ledge. For this, I trimmed a piece of my 1x6 board to about 10 inches long and ripped it into 1.5 inch wide strips. If you don't have a table saw, you could use pre-cut 1x2s for this part instead. I glued 2 of these strips together and then allowed them to dry. Then I glued this ledge onto the back panel. If you wanted to use a few brad nails here, you could, but I just used glue and waited for it to dry. While that dried, I cut the final piece of the project, the stand. This piece has ends beveled 30 degrees, so I adjusted my miter saw to 30 degrees and cut. If your miter saw isn't large enough to cut a 1x6 standing up, you could lay it flat and adjust the bevel angle instead. I made this back stand so that it folds in for easy storage, so I used a simple decorative cabinet butt hinge to attach it. I installed it to the edge of the back stand first, making sure it was centered side to side. Then I placed it on the back side of the back panel, lined up the bottom edges, and installed the other end onto the back. A small screwdriver was helpful here, as the screws are pretty small and the drill can easily strip them out. After the back stand was attached, I finished it with walrus oil furniture butter, and it was ready to gift. This project is perfect for a cookbook stand, a book display, or even a photo display. It makes the perfect hostess gift during the holidays. The third gift idea is one that I've personally been making and giving for years. It's a super simple project that everyone always loves to get. And the best part is you can make it from a single 2x4 board. First, I squared off the rounded edges of my 2x4 on the table saw. Then I ripped this board into 2.5 inch wide strips, which is a 2x2. I trimmed these 2 strips into 10 16-inch long pieces. Then I glued them up into a solid panel, making sure to keep it as flat as possible. Once dry, I attach my homemade circle jig to my router and set it up to cut a 14-inch diameter circle from this panel. If you didn't want to mess with a router, you can just cut this out with a jigsaw or a bandsaw instead. I don't love cutting circles with a router, so I just made a few shallow passes with it to get my initial shape cut. Then I used a jigsaw to cut away the rest of the material and a flush cut bit to smooth the edges. I apologize that my arm is totally in the way of the camera here. I did not realize that until after it was finished. My bad. Then I sanded the top, bottom, and sides of this piece until it was flat and smooth. Whenever I've made these in the past, I always like to personalize them with an initial, a name, or a shape. For this particular piece, I cut out a Kentucky shape with my Cricut machine to apply to the top. Before staining, I flipped it over and centered a small Lazy Susan on the bottom and screwed it in. Then I applied wood stain to the pieces and removed the stencil. After the stain dried, I sealed it with a clear coat and now it's ready for gifting. The next project is a simple Tic Tac Toe board. You can make this from all kinds of scraps and in all kinds of sizes. To make this one, I started out with a piece of 3/4 inch plywood for the bottom. I cut this roughly 12 inches square, sanded, and then stained it black. Then I cut to fit 1x2s around it with 45-degree mitered ends to trim it out. Once I had these pieces cut to size, I carefully glued and brad nailed them along the edges. For the tic-tac-toe pieces, I cut 9 pieces of 2x4 to 3.5 inches long, so that made them squares. I sanded these well, then placed them inside the tray. I had some scrap 1/2-inch square dowel in the shop that fit perfectly between the pieces, so I cut to fit them inside the tray to divide it into 9 equal-sized sections. After I had all the pieces cut and dry fit together, I removed them, sanded them, then carefully glued them back in piece by piece. I found it helpful to keep the 2x4 blocks here while I worked around them to help me keep the spacing right. The final part was finishing the tic-tac-toe pieces. You can simply stain these 2 different colors, draw or paint X's and O's on them, or carve them out. But I used my Cricut again to cut some X and O vinyl pieces to stick onto the blocks. Initially, I was going to use the vinyl as a stain stencil and remove them after I stained. But I changed my mind after I stained the O's and left the vinyl stencils in place and then just applied a clear coat to all of the pieces and to the tray. This is such a fun little gift idea that could be scaled up or down as needed. fifth handmade gift idea might be the easiest, a cutting board. I purchased a 1x6x8 maple board to use for the majority of this cutting board and combined it with some walnut and wormy maple scraps that I already had in the shop to give it some extra color. All of these boards were not the same thickness, and I did not want to have to run them through the planer. So instead, I ripped them down into equal width strips of about 1.5 inches wide. In addition to the scraps, I also ripped my 1x6x8 maple board into 3 strips, but I totally forgot to press record on the camera. Sorry about that. Once the pieces were all cut to equal widths, I trimmed down my maple to about 19-inch long pieces and laid out all my boards on their sides on the workbench. I cut enough pieces so that when laid out together, the board would be about 12 to 13 inches wide. Then I glued them up. I almost glued them all up at once, but I thought better of it and split these pieces in half to glue them up in 2 sections. Glue ups are already stressful, and I find that gluing up a bunch of pieces at once is usually a little bit more challenging than just a few at a time. After both sections were glued and dried, I glued them together into one large panel. Once this was dry, I trimmed the edges square to give me a cutting board roughly 18 inches long. And now it was time for sanding. If you have a planer, you can certainly run this through the planer to flatten and clean up both sides. I have a planer, but it needs new blades and I just haven't bought new ones yet. So instead, I used a belt sander and a level to help me flatten out both sides of the board. This really wasn't a bad process, just a little dusty. After flattening, I sanded all of the surfaces well up to 220 grit to get the board nice and smooth. Then I used a chamfer bit in my router to smooth out these sharp corners. I gave it one final hand sanding before adding cutting board oil to finish it up. Cutting boards are such simple projects that make the perfect gift for holidays and housewarmings. You can customize it with different woods or engrave a name on it if you'd like. And that's a wrap, pun intended, on these handmade gift ideas. I hope you enjoyed watching these come together, and I hope they've given you some inspiration for the upcoming holiday season. Thanks so much for watching, friends, and until next time, happy building!